All right, great. We're recording now and we're good to go. Thanks a lot. All right, so our topic tonight is going to be renovating and pruning old orchards, or taming the beast, as I like to call it. So just before I get started, a little introduction. I'm Mike Bastow, and I'm a regional tree fruit specialist, and I'm with the Eastern New York Commercial Horticulture Program. So we're one of Cornell's regional programs, and we cover 17 counties throughout Eastern New York, and I'm based all the way up north in Clinton County. So when we talk about pruning, the first question that sometimes comes up is, why do we want to prune? So the big thing is that apples and really all tree fruit need sunlight. Um, Here is a graph that actually talks about the amount of sunlight that we need to get different fruit qualities. So for good size, we actually want over 50% full sunlight into the canopy. For good red color, we want actually over 70% full sunlight. And for spur development, just to get flower production and to get fruit, we need at least 30% sunlight. So that's why in a lot of the older trees, you might not get as much apple development because you don't have enough sunlight. So pruning is one way that we can correct that. That really allows us to get more sunlight into the middle of the tree, get fruiting wood back into the bottom of the tree, and just have a healthier all-around tree. It also makes spraying a lot easier, and it just moves the air around the tree a lot better. So overall, pruning does a lot of good for the tree. So this kind of just shows, and this is from an old publication, but still very relevant, where the sunlight gets distributed in the tree. So in the top third of the canopy is where we get 100 to 60% full sunlight. As we get deeper into the canopy, though, that level drops substantially. So within about 3 feet, if you reach your arm into the tree, it pretty much drops down to this 29 to 0% sunlight. And so that's really where a bulk of these large old trees are at, in that interior canopy. So if we go back to this chart, we're not even really getting much fruit development in that interior of the tree. So that's really why this pruning and getting light in is so vital to really getting good fruit production. So when we have low light levels into the middle of the tree, as I just mentioned, we're not getting much fruit production. We're also not getting much new wood growth. So that's where we kind of have these situations where you'll see in these old trees, you'll have a lot of the new growth all the way at the top on the outer edges. And what we're really left with in the middle is this sort of dead zone where not much is really happening. So the big thing that we do with pruning is to correct that, get that sunlight in, so we can move the fruit back more towards the middle and lower into the tree. So before I go any further, if you're thinking about pruning your old trees, I just kind of like to present both sides of the coin about whether or not it's really worth your time. The pros of it, your trees are already going to be established. They have that height. So if you're in an area with bad deer pressure, or if you're already dealing with weeds, you're already established. So you don't have to worry about that, as opposed to if you were to put in a new planting. A lot of the old orchards, particularly looking further south in the Hudson Valley, that a lot of people, will buy a property and these old trees will be on, might have some heirloom varieties that are harder to find. A lot of times there'll be old varieties like Baldwins and Greenings and Spies, and they definitely still have a bit of a following. So that is a nice pro with it. And a lot of times homeowners really like to have a tree that has fruit on it. It really kind of serves as more of a landscape feature. So that's definitely another positive for it. Some of the cons, though, they are most likely going to be very tall if they've been very overgrown. And depending on how long they've been there, very likely to be filled with diseases and pests. And it will take a couple of years before that tree gets back in a decent production, if not as long as if you were to start fresh with a new tree. And as I mentioned, the heirloom varieties, sometimes they might be old varieties that really you might not be that interested in. They might be an old variety that's really soft and doesn't store well. It might be really disease susceptible. So that one can kind of go either way. But, with all that being said, if you're committed to it and you want to do it, then let's proceed forward. So speaking of old varieties, I get questions a lot. How do I know what apple this is? You know, I picked it off. I don't know what it was. The old homeowner knew, but they weren't quite sure anymore. So here's two online tools that I recommend to people. It's applename.com, and Orange Pippin also has a resource. And the nice thing here is when you get the fruit in the fall, you can go through and it kind of keys out for you. You can see here, what's the skin color? Are there stripes? And a number of other questions. This particular site, I think, has well over 100 different features that you can pick out to try to narrow it down to a couple for you. And then from there, depending on how old the tree might be, you can get a good idea of what it might be. So that's a good resource to. So getting a little bit into pruning now, you know, having the proper tools is super important. The big one that I recommend to homeowners in particular, if you can keep your feet on the ground, you know, it's going to be much safer. So a pole chainsaw is a really nice tool to have. You know, you can get some good extension with it. You might still need some ladder work, but you know, you're not all the way up. Certainly another pole pruner and a pole saw go a long way. You're also going to want a handsaw, a pair of loppers, and some hand pruners as well, and most likely another regular chainsaw. Particularly in the early years, we're going to be making some really big cuts on these old limbs, so a chainsaw is definitely going to be really handy for you. I also want to bring up some terms as we go through these pruning guides. We kind of use this weird terminology in horticulture, so I think it's always good to kind of review them. So I'm going to be talking a lot about these three different structures on the tree. The first one being the leader. So this is really, in this case, the main trunk of the tree. We can also use it on this tree here. Kind of these different trunks are all sort of mini leaders. So that's what I'll mean when I refer to a leader. The scaffolds are going to be these permanent horizontal branches. They go pretty much all the way up through the tree. And on this tree over here, we can also think of these as sort of being scaffolds. They're kind of hybrid leaders going into scaffolds. And then there's the lateral branches. So these are these smaller, younger branches. And these are sort of temporary branches that are going to be coming primarily off of the scaffolds. So just keep those terms in mind as we go through, because I'm going to be mentioning them quite a bit. So I'll also be talking about a couple different types of cuts, so it's good to review them. The main two being heading cuts and thinning cuts. So a heading cut is when we remove only a portion of a shoot or the limb. So this does a couple of things. When we do a heading cut, it allows dormant buds beneath that growing tip to break now. So it's going to stimulate new growth near that cut, and it's going to induce branching. And generally when we do this, we're going to end up with less spurs or fruiting wood, and we're going to end up with more long, vegetative, unproductive shoots. And this is going to inhibit flowering on young trees. And where you make the cut has consequences. So in younger wood, we get more growth right around the cut, whereas if we did it lower on the branch, again, where that cut's made is where we're going to see the most regrowth. So when are heading cuts used? When we're looking at older trees, generally it's going to be to stimulate growth of new wood on these older trees in the leader or the scaffolds. And we're also going to use them to head back to weak side limbs into older wood so we can shorten them back. Kind of like here you can see, if this was the original limb, this is older wood. And so we cut back here, shorten the limb. We got this regrowth, but we can remove that later. And then some of the spurs got some extra growth as well. So these are just a couple photos of what heading cuts look like. The other type I mentioned is thinning cuts. And this one's pretty simple. It's when we remove basically an entire shoot or branch back to where it joined the branch of the higher order. So when I say that, what do I mean by the higher order? Thinking back to those terms I mentioned, it could be removing smaller secondary shoots off the lateral. It could be taking those lateral branches and cutting them all the way back to the main scaffold. Or it could also be removing scaffolds all the way back to the leader. So things like that. The big thing with this is it does not give us as much regrowth as those heading cuts do. It's a much calmer cut. So we use these when we're taking out large old limbs to lower the tree height because we don't get as much regrowth. And we do this when we're opening up the canopy because we're going to get less growth around it as well, particularly in the upper portion of these overgrown trees. And also when we're taking out some of the older laterals on the scaffolds so we can space them out. And over time, other buds will break along that scaffold and replace them. So here you can see on this limb, these limbs came off that scaffold, and this is what we ended up with. So here's two examples of thinning cuts. You can see in this case, this would have been a young scaffold, and they brought this all the way back to the leader. So a third type of cut that we'll talk about occasionally is a stub cut. And this is very much essentially a thinning cut. The only difference, rather than cutting it clean back to the trunk or the scaffold, we actually leave an inch or two of a stub, as the name implies. And the thought there is that by leaving a little bit of extra tissue, there's going to be a dormant bud within that stub. And our hope is that that will break and start to grow so that we can replace that old limb. So if it's a good spot along the trunk or the branch, and we liked having a limb there, but it's just too old and we want a new one to replace it eventually, that's where we would use a stub cut. All right, so with that, a good pausing place. Are there any questions so far? Feel free to type those into the chat box. I'll give you a minute to do that. All right, well, keep on going then. But if you do have any questions along the way. All right, Katja asked, how much thinning should be done on old trees? Yep, so I think we might have talked about this before, but you can take out about a third of the wood when you are starting off before you start to really damage the tree. That's definitely the upper limit. And I'll mention in a little bit, the more pruning you do, the more regrowth you're likely to get. So we want to, be really strategic with our pruning so that we're only taking out as much as we need to kind of curb that regrowth. But you can take out to about a third before you really start negatively impacting the health of that tree. All right, great question. Thank you. All right, so with that information, where do we kind of start? We've got our tools, we know those different cuts, we're out in the orchard. Where do we start? So the first step that I would recommend is take out the dead wood because that doesn't really impact health of the tree at all. When we think about the partitioning of carbon within the tree, dead wood, you just can get rid of it whenever. After that, you want to decide how tall you want your tree to end up. And so this is going to depend on a couple different factors. So think about how much time you want to spend on the ladder. If you're going to be spraying your trees, what kind of equipment do you have? How far up can your spray reach? If your sprayer can only get a spray up to about 18 feet tall, you don't want your trees at 25 feet. And then how are you going to be harvesting your fruit? Again, that kind of ties into the ladder, just how much up and down you want. But then once you know that, the other thing to think about is also what kind of tree shape are you looking for? So look at that tree, and this is the example I used earlier. When we talk about these big, old, large trees, I kind of think of it as being one of two shapes that we're striving for. And again, it's not going to be textbook cookie cutter. You're going to have to adjust it, but the two main ones are this central leader, where we have that one main trunk, the scaffolds coming off of it, or you can go more of the multi-leader, where we have multiple leaders leading into scaffolds. So when you look at this tree, you can kind of think about how you can make some big cuts to make that shape eventually happen. So when I look at this tree, I think, oh, well, I can maybe keep a big limb over here. maybe get one going out in this direction, and maybe it'll be a multi-leader, but just have a rough idea in your head where you might be going. So when you have the size of the tree and the rough shape, we then want to start strategically lowering that tree. And my recommendation is to do that in 3-foot increments every year to get to your target. So the example I've given here, you have a 30-foot apple tree. You want it to be eventually 18 feet. So, you're going to have to plan on taking about 4 years to get it to the height that you want it to be at. And to do that, we're going to cut large vertical limbs back to weak side limbs to manage our regrowth. Because if we're cutting back to weaker limbs, it's a heading cut, but since we're cutting it back to a weak side limb, it kind of serves like a thinning cut, so we don't get as much of that wild regrowth. You'll still get a good amount though. Then again, I mentioned here you can take out about 1/3 of the total tree canopy every year before we do much damage to the tree. And I would just caution that going faster than that 3 feet per year or more than 1/3 will cause excessive regrowth and will likely hurt the tree. So, let's kind of look about how we would go about doing that. I always recommend that you don't top the leader, and by that I mean just go doing a straight across chop right here, because what you end up with is a tree that looks kind of like this. You just get a lot of vertical growth all around where you made those cuts, so we definitely don't want to do that. So instead, we're going to want to use those thinning cuts on overgrown scaffolds, or we're going to want to, like I mentioned, head the leader back to young, weak growing side limbs so that we can redirect the tree's energy in the spring so it grows back a little bit more calm. We don't get that much regrowth like we see down here. My other big recommendation is to make only a few big cuts in the first year rather than making a lot of small cuts. So think more of your big chainsaw cuts instead of doing a lot of tiny little hand pruner stuff. And also we want to start in the first year from the top of the tree and then slowly working our way into the bottom. Because again, our big goal is to get sunlight back into the tree. So to do that, we really got to start at the top and open that back up and then slowly work our way down so we can get the sun to filter back into the tree. So Katja, I see your question here. Yeah, reshaping will lead to invigoration. So what we want to do, like I mentioned, is we want to reshape slowly over time and do it incrementally. So we'll still get that reinvigoration and that growth back. But by being slow about it, we can kind of slow it down. So here's an example tree, just to kind of give an idea. And so in this case, we'll say this tree had a main leader. You can see in the center here. So this is kind of a tree that you might not find too easily. It's kind of an idealized, but if this was your tree and it was the first year, as I mentioned, we would want to start by making those thinning cuts. So you can see, this cut here, we thin back to the main leader there. We take out another one along the trunk as well. Then we want to just slowly lower it back down using some of those thinning cuts. And, maybe right there was 3 feet, most likely, so we'd probably stop right there. But just to give you a few more ideas where we would go with this tree, we'd eventually take that one out and just kind of start to open up the canopy. In this case, we actually made a thinning cut all the way down at the base of the tree. And so if that was your first year, you might want to stop right there. So here's another example. I think this might be more what we might tend to find, sort of a tree that has no real main central leader, a lot of different limbs that are kind of going in all different directions. And so the examples they give here are that, again, we want to make those thinning cuts. And this time they would be made all the way back to the main trunk here. And slowly taking them out. And again, this just kind of illustrates that over time we want to open up the tree. But I would make these cuts over successive years. So, maybe in this first year we take this one out, take that one out the next year, slowly working the tree back down. And then once we open it up, also working these back down so we get more of the light in and hopefully then get more branches to break later on. Here's another example, and this one goes through in a bit more in depth. We can kind of slowly work our way through this. So again, let's say this is the first year, and I think this tree is a bit more of what you might expect to see in your plantings. You know, in this tree, there really isn't a very strong leader anywhere, but there are also a lot of like scaffolds here and there, so we can kind of, I think it's more likely what you're going to see. So in the first year, we're going to start with the dormant pruning. And I should mention, generally all the pruning that we're going to be doing in apples is going to be in the dormant season. So generally that's going to be, we usually recommend February, March. In large commercial orchards, they might start a little bit earlier, sometime in January. But March is a really good time to do that. Part of why we're having this workshop tonight. It's kind of on everyone's minds right now. So again, what are the big cuts that we would want to do as we're starting off? So we want to start in the top again. And in this case, we would head the large upper leader back to a lateral. So here you can see in this diagram, there was a large leader that kind of became a scaffold. And so we headed that back, but we headed that back to a side limb. So by doing that, what's going to happen is a lot of that excess growth is going to go into this limb now. And this limb's actually going to control some of that regrowth. Now, the other thing that we recommend here is that ideally we want to cut back to a weak horizontal, but in this illustration, it was back to a vigorous vertical. What they recommend doing here is actually tipping this back as well. And so by doing that, it's going to keep it from just growing straight up really high. It's actually going to make this also break and kind of spread that regrowth out a little bit. So some other things we want to do in that first year, let's say that cut lowered our tree effectively about 3 feet or so. We'd also want to start heading back some of these large scaffold limbs at the top. So you can see here at C, this original one went very far and was really shading this other portion of the tree. So we went ahead and cut this back. And again, we want to cut it back just above a side limb, preferably again, one that is growing relatively horizontally, one that's going to be much weaker. Because again, even though it's a heading cut, because there's a weak side limb that we're cutting back to, that one's going to get most of the energy from the tree when it breaks its dormancy, and it's going to keep it calmer and hopefully reduce some of that regrowth that we're going to get. The other thing we can do in this first year is also start to remove some of the less vigorous wood further down in the tree. And again, you might not get to this your first year if you've already made a few really big cuts at the top. But if you haven't reached that 1/3 yet, a lot of this wood that's dangling down here, and you see this a lot on the old trees, this wood that's growing straight down, it's very weak. It's never going to be very fruitful, and it's all just kind of shading each other. So what we want to do is thin some of those out. And so making those thinning cuts along those limbs are going to go a long way. And again, the idea there, just to get that sunlight back throughout that tree. Then, you know, after we made those cuts, at this point, we probably lowered it by 3 feet, probably taking out close to 1/3. So we'd want to stop there. So following that first winter, even if you made those cuts well, I think you're still pretty likely to get something that looks kind of like this tree on the left. Essentially, these trees, when we prune them back, there's a balance between the root system and the shoot system. And when we do this pruning, the tree wants to keep that balance. So when we remove a lot of the upper canopy in the spring, the tree's going to want to restore that balance. So it's going to put out a lot of this really excessive regrowth. And again, that's why we want to be strategic with it. so we can minimize that regrowth as much as we can. So if you do see this in the first summer, as it's growing, feel free to go in and just remove some of these shoots during the summer. What that's going to do is it's going to remove some of the vigor from the tree, and it's also going to get more sunlight during the summertime. So now we're going to go into our second year back to dormant, so that next February or March. As I just showed you in that last picture, you probably had a lot of regrowth. So we're going to have a lot of these near the top of the trees, near where we made those old cuts. So we're going to want to remove at least half of those new upright shoots that came out of those cuts in the first year, because those are really going to be very unproductive because they're so upright. They're not really going to put on a lot of fruit. So we can take most of those out because they're just going to shade everything that's lower down. The other big thing is that we're going to want to continue working down those leaders and those scaffolds slowly. We can either thin them out, as I mentioned, or again, cut them back to older wood. Weaker side limbs are preferable. You can see that here in B. Again, we would, if this cut wasn't made the last season, we would slowly keep working this limb back. The other thing we can do is use thinning cuts to space out our horizontal scaffolds along the trunk so that none are directly on top of each other or shading each other. And we want to choose limbs that are relatively flat and young if possible, and ones that are radiating towards the outside of the tree. We don't want to keep anything that's going back into the interior of the tree. And again, as I mentioned, if there was a limb that was in a good spot, but it's just too old or too big, you can leave a stub cut there. And what will hopefully happen then is by leaving that stub, more likely than not, you're going to get excessive regrowth off of that. But we can use that to be a new branch later on, potentially. So continuing on, another year has gone by. Now we're into the third dormant season. So we want to just kind of continue with those same principles as we just been talking about. So it kind of starts getting repetitive for us. So keep on working that tree down. Again, you can see in this example, we're going to head those leaders back to lower side limbs. So in this case, we actually took out some of the leader from that other limb that was here, and now we're down to a lower branch. So this is kind of the new top of our tree. You can see in this case, the scaffold was cut back further to another side limb, and again, it was tipped here to try to reduce some of that regrowth that they got. Down in C, you can see we also are starting to work this one back. We want to shorten that back down because what we're really trying to do is eventually end up with a pyramid-shaped tree. So we want to have short scaffolds at the top here and longer ones at the bottom. Sorry about that. And again, that kind of relates back to that idea of getting sunlight into the tree. That way we can get as much down into the interior and hopefully start getting fruitful wood back throughout the whole length or height of the tree. So fourth year, if we go back to our original example, this should be the final year of taking out 3 feet to get ourselves back to the height we wanted at. So again, if you haven't reached your desired height yet, we could take another one out, keep working our way down. If you have reached your desired height now, you can leave the top as it is, because as we keep pruning, as I mentioned, it's disruptive. So the more we take out, the more regrowth we're going to get. So if it's at the right height, just leave it be that year. The main thing I would stress with that is once you've established if the tree is going to be sort of this central leader kind of tree, we want that main trunk to be the tallest point on the tree. So if there's any new limbs that are growing around it, we want to remove those because the way the tree regulates itself is through different plant hormones, and in this case, auxin. So what auxin does is it reduces the growth of those buds beneath it, which is a big part of the reason why when we cut off the tips in a heading cut, we get all that regrowth around it. So by keeping that leader in place, that helps us better keep that pyramid form of the tree, because the further away you get from that tip, the more regrowth you get. So that's how the tree kind of naturally wants to grow. So it's important that we keep that at the tallest point on the tree. But every once in a while, again, if that leader gets too tall and we need to cut it back down, my recommendation is to choose another branch on that same trunk. And again, one that's growing relatively slowly, relatively horizontally, and we'll cut back just above that one so that can take over. And because it's growing slowly, hopefully we won't get too much regrowth out of there. It'll continue to be relatively calm. Other things to do in the 4th year, at this point we can really start concentrating on the scaffolds a bit more, really keep working them back. All this upright wood that's going to keep coming and replacing it as we head them back, we can remove some of those to open it up further. And I believe the next slide we're going to look a little bit more closely at some detailed scaffold limb pruning. Another thing I want to point out is that hopefully at this point, as we're getting more sunlight into the bottom of the tree, some of the buds that are down here, should start breaking. So where we didn't have wood before, hopefully we're starting to get some new growth down there, and hopefully we're going to start getting some spur development and some new flowers lower in the tree. So now we'll talk a little bit more about those scaffold limbs. Let's say we're done heading them back. They're at the point where they're about as long as you want them to be. How do you then prune them after that? And so you can really use this in that year and for subsequent years of pruning for it. So the first recommendation is we want to end that limb in a fruitful lateral. And because there's fruit buds on it, that's going to take a lot of energy, and that's going to slow down its regrowth. This is kind of here in A. You can see we had this lateral here, and you can see there's some fruit spurs on there. So once this has grown for 2 years, we can actually cut back to that 2-year-old wood to where we start seeing those spurs forming. And the idea there is we want that limb to kind of stiffen up a bit. And because there's those fruit limbs there, hopefully we won't get too much excessive growth further from that lateral on the tree. But after that, we want to, again, space out the laterals that remain. In this case, there were a couple that were close together, so we took this one out completely with a thinning cut. We want to be choosing ones that are relatively flat, relatively horizontal. That's where we're going to get most of our fruit. And again, that relates back to the hormones in the trees as well. Very vertical branches tend to grow a lot, don't put on a lot of fruit. So particularly on these scaffolds, because that's where our fruiting wood is going to be, we want to really maximize the horizontal growth of these limbs. The angle that we're really looking for there is about 60 degrees. So just above horizontal is ideal for good fruit production. And so with the rest of them, the ones that we don't thin out, we're going to head those back. Or we're going to, again, head those back to growing side shoots. And the idea there is part of this concept of what we call sort of singulating. Essentially what we want to do is we want them all to come out and just go off in one point. We don't want any of these forks or any Ys in the trees. And again, we do that because we want to eliminate a lot of the shadowing that we get. So when we have a lot of multiple branching like this off the laterals, a lot of times what happens, take this area. If we let all this grow, if we were to let all this grow, we would get a decent amount of shading on this limb. So by singulating there, we can kind of make sure that each lateral and thereby each scaffold is still getting a decent amount of sunlight so that all those apples are going to be high quality. So looking back to what we started with and where we ended up with, this is where we're hopefully going to be at after 4 or 5 years, or maybe it's going to take a little bit longer, but sort of what we're hoping for. The main outcomes being that we're able to lower that height to a more manageable level. Hopefully, in the case of this central leader type of tree, we've restored this pyramidal Christmas tree shape, which I outlined for you here. Again, having those really short scaffolds near the top and hopefully longer near the bottom. And hopefully we now have new fruitful laterals and scaffolds throughout the height of the tree. That younger wood is going to be where we get the best fruit. So by continuously over time renewing some of these shoots with those thinning cuts, we'll always have younger wood that's going to be more productive and produce the best apples. I wanted to present this to you guys as well. I'm sure, if you have old trees, you're probably going to have a couple that might look like this, where, and this is from a commercial orchard, and it was really sort of the perfect real life example of the diagram, so I had to include it. In this case, what happened kind of to that full extent, all this was filled in at one point, so there was no sunlight down in the interior, and so there was no new growth at all beneath this really, really thick area. So what ends up happening is we don't have any side limbs to cut back to. And as we just talked about, the idea when we're pruning them back down is to cut back to weak side limbs. So if that's the case, you can make some really drastic cuts to try to bring these trees back down. So what would happen in this case is we would actually cut all the way back down to the trunk. And what that does is it forces new growth. I know it looks drastic, but like I mentioned, the trees want to restore that balance. So if we were to make a cut that big, that tree would want to push that much regrowth. And I kind of spell it out a little bit more on this next slide. So in that first year, we would head those branches all the way back low. And as I mentioned, we only want to do a third of the tree at a time. So in this case, that is a really drastic cut. So do one of those limbs at a time. So expect this to be a really long-term project. As new shoots grow from the stump in that first year, we're going to want to thin that down to 1 or 2 new leaders that are coming up from that. Because that's such a drastic cut, there's going to be a lot of shoots coming off of that. But we're going to want to pick 1 or 2 out of that one. Following winter, we're going to want to head those leaders just above where we want new scaffold branches to be. Because again, by cutting off the tip, that's going to force those side limbs to break, and then we can train them to be our new scaffolds. So as I mentioned here, we're going to be training those new scaffolds horizontally during that next growing season. Then from there, we're going to continue growing those leaders, and we're going to continue heading them back slightly every year so we can get a couple new layers of scaffolds over the next couple of years. So again, it's very drastic. It takes a lot of work. And what I put here is, when you really kind of think about it, if you're starting from 3 feet above the ground and are essentially retraining the entire tree, if the tree isn't this bad of shape, unless you have like some kind of really strong connection to it, I really think in this case, it actually probably makes more sense to cut it down completely and replace it with a brand new healthy tree that won't have diseases or anything. It can be the variety you want it to be. So it's kind of up to you, but it can be done. But I think with the amount of time that you'd have to invest in a tree that's in this situation, it might make more sense to start fresh. All right, so that was a lot of material and a lot of fairly complicated stuff. Does anybody have any questions? I think this is a good place to pause. I see Aaron did ask a question. So yeah, You definitely can graft onto wild apple trees. We might have some concerns where if it's a if it's a crab apple, we might have some compatibility issues, but if it's a from a standard wild apple, most likely you can graft to that. But as I mentioned similarly there, Aaron, I try to think in terms of that root to shoot ratio. So if you were to hack off a lot of the limbs and then stick a tiny little bud stick in there, positive and negatives, that bud stick is probably going to push really heavily that first year. Um, so you might get some really excessive growth off of there, but that could also be a good thing. You might be able to grow it out pretty quickly. In that case, I would definitely recommend doing one small branch at a time. And Scott, I am recording this currently, so it will be available later. And this goes for everyone. If you want a copy of the recording, just give me a heads up and I can send you the link sometime early next week. All right, so are there any other questions before we move on to the next set of slides? All right, well, I'll keep on rolling, but feel free to keep sending in your questions. If the tree is lopsided, can you stimulate growth? Yeah, so I think you can, Steve. And we can be really kind of strategic with those different cuts that I was talking about. And I'll show a really good picture of this later, but as I mentioned, with those heading cuts, and this kind of goes against the sort of cookie cutter ideas that we've been talking about, but so with a heading cut, we know that we can get some really strong regrowth from that. So if you have a lopsided tree and you make a heading cut, you'll probably get a lot of regrowth from that, and then you could train a limb out of that and then train it to the point where you want it to be to try to restore some balance. So I think that is an option. You're just going to have to really, probably keep up on it to make sure you're training it to try to get it from being too lopsided. But, I think there's some ways. Can you be a little more specific about what you mean by lower? And Scott, I can get those slides over to you. I can put it on Google or Dropbox if you have one of those accounts, and I can get them over to you. And what I can actually do is do a PDF of it so I can email it out to you as well. So that would probably be the easiest thing. Yep. So like I was mentioning here, Steve, this would be one of those situations where we want to get those lower laterals to break. And so, as I mentioned, as we get more sunlight into the tree, and slightly less drastic example where we might have some side limbs further down, as we get more sunlight down, there's still dormant buds along these trunks. But as we get into this really old wood, it's less likely that it's going to break, but they still could once we get more sunlight onto them. But in this example, because all this growth is really high up, it's less likely that we're going to get that to happen. So that's why we would come in and make these more drastic cuts lower down to try to get that regrowth. All right, great. Anything else before I move on, guys? All right, well, feel free to keep typing them in there. So once we get through that first 4 or so years, and again, like I said, this is going to be a sort of a long-term investment, then we can, once we're past the really drastic stuff, it's more of just some maintenance. And this is where things start getting a bit easier for us. So I really recommend that you get out and prune every year so we can avoid sort of some of these situations that I showed you earlier. Again, my recommendation is still to prune from the top down because that sunlight's going to filter down from the top. So we can do the most good if we're pruning out the really thick stuff at the top rather than if we start at the bottom of the tree. And again, my main recommendation is if we have limbs that are growing too tall, too vigorously, we want to cut those back to a weak shoot so we can maintain our targeted tree height, just to kind of maintain the leader right about where we want it. So once we have the leader set, there's a couple other really simple rules for doing maintenance pruning. We kind of want to focus on a couple key problems in the tree. So I would prune out anything that's dead, remove anything that's damaged, and anything that's obviously diseased. I would take out any upright water sprouts, and these are very vigorous limbs that grow near the interior of the tree. You can see a couple of them right here. Those, because they grow so straight up, are never going to put any fruit on. They're just going to shade the tree. We want to take those out. We want to thin those all the way out. You don't want to leave a stub cut there because it's just going to return new water sprouts. That'll never do anything for you. So be sure to thin those down. We also want to take out any weak drooping wood. So looking at this example here, here's a bit of weak growth here. It's going up, but it's not really growing much. So we take that out. Here's sort of that weak drooping that I'm talking about. Anything that's really below that horizontal, it's going to get shaded by this scaffold here. So we want to thin that out as well. Same with this one over here. We want to, again, simplify or singulate some of those lateral branches and thin some more lateral branches, space those out so we can get more sunlight back into the interior of the tree. We'll kind of walk through this, kind of showing what that looks like. So this is our unpruned tree. And in this case, we started with those water sprouts. Took out some of these. We took these out with thinning cuts, and we removed those because they were too upright and they're a little too upright close to the main trunk. Again, we want to keep things growing horizontally and close, towards the outside growth of the tree, away from the trunk. So we take those out. Again, those weak, low-growing branches that are going to be shaded and not put on much fruit, we would take those out as well. And then in this case, this is a good example of what we were talking about a bit earlier. On this side of the tree, there were just, a couple too many scaffolds very close to each other. So this one was just shading this lower one, and this one was in a better position, so we would thin that one out completely. And this might be one of those times where you might want to use a stub cut because maybe you want to slowly replace that limb, and then when this one gets older, maybe we take that out and stub that one back. So the idea there is that, particularly on smaller trees, renewing these limbs over time. But a lot of these scaffolds will be relatively permanent. We'd only really do that if they're getting a bit older, or again, if they're shading each other out like that. Here's another couple. They were growing kind of scraggly. Again, we wanted to simplify this scaffold, take out some of those really upright or downward laterals. And then at the top here, and again, this kind of goes against my philosophy of starting from the top and then working your way down. But, for example's sake here, we took these out because, again, they were growing very vertically, a little bit closer to the interior of the tree. And we wanted to simplify our scaffolds and our laterals for sunlight in. And then near the top here, this is another concept that I was talking about earlier. You can see we took these limbs out, and I'll go back and forth there. I mentioned how it's important that we're protecting the leader because that really kind of sets up the structure of the tree. So when we have these other side limbs that are kind of encroaching on it, if they get taller, that one's going to take over and suppress the main leader. So we want to keep that one growing pretty upright. And then as that leader gets too tall, as I mentioned, we would make the cut right about here, and maybe then we'd want this to be the new leader. But we want to be the one making that decision. Here you can see where we started with, and this is what we ended up with at the end. And so, as I mentioned, we really want to open up the tree And if you drive through, if you're heading down the thruway, down in the Hudson Valley, there's some really good examples. There's a couple big orchard blocks along the highway there. I think what surprises a lot of people sometimes is just how much wood you can take out of a tree for pruning. The trees kind of look scraggly at the end, but we're not pruning them to be an ornamental tree. We're really pruning to get as much sunlight in to get the best fruit that we can. And so, as I mentioned, you can take out up to a third before you start doing too much damage. So it doesn't always need to be a third because, again, you're going to get some regrowth. So we want to make as few cuts as needed. But we do want to open up the tree, and we can do that with as little regrowth by making a lot of those thinning cuts, or again, by making heading cuts, but ones that go back to a weak side limb. All right, so any questions on maintenance pruning? All right, well, I'll keep going on. So we're actually getting pretty close to the end here, so I apologize I didn't time it out too well, but that'll give us time for more questions then. So this is just a quick case study. So this is an orchard of someone that I know down in the capital region, and he was in a very similar position as I'm sure a number of you might be. He bought a property and it had an orchard, and he said the trees that were on it were probably over 40 years old, many of them over 30, 40 feet tall. And he wanted to keep the trees. He thought there were some interesting varieties in there, and he didn't want to start from scratch. So he decided he was going to prune them back down. So here's a couple of photos, or here's a photo of a couple of the trees. And I think this one on the right is an example of what he was starting out with. So a couple of them were just really tall. You can see very thick, just some of them lopsided. So really a good example, because in those diagrams I showed you, I think they kind of give you the perfect idealized old tree. So this is really good to see just some of the things that you guys might be working with. So I just want to share with you some of the things that he did as he went through the process. And I believe he is now on year 3 or 4. So he's had some really good, if I could go back and do it again, here's what I'd do differently. But he also has some really nice examples in here. So again, here's some of the trees that he was working with. You can see a lot of really long scaffolds at the top, really kind of just all over the place. So you can tell, like, this is like an umbrella, right? It's all the sunlight's just getting stuck at the top. Nothing's getting further down into the tree. Also, a lot of that really weak, spindly growth, and that is because so little light was getting down into the tree. So obviously a lot of stuff that's going to be removed here. And you can see there was a cut made here at some point, but this was still pretty early on in the pruning process, I believe. And so you can see this was from his first dormant pruning. I think the big takeaways from this are mostly really big cuts. You know, he wasn't getting in there with his hand pruners and snipping away one little branch by another. This is really the chainsaw year, and we want to really thin these back or bringing the height down, generally by 3 feet at a time. So this might be a situation where another learning example, and you'll see in some of the later photos, you know, I wouldn't have taken this much vertical out all in 1 year. I would have done this slowly over the course of a few years, because you can see some of these limbs are very long. So hard to say if these were all upright or not, but we want to do that gradually over time. So here's a good example. I think we were talking about what happens when you leave a stump or a stub, or if you don't head back all the way. So you can see he had made a cut here from that vertical. And like I mentioned, the roots want to restore that balance in the tree. So what did the tree do? There's a dormant bud right in here. That one broke and just took off and most likely grew very upright to replace that limb. And so depending on how we want to reshape the tree, like in that last example where we didn't have any good branches, that could be a situation where we can then trade that new limb. But if that was at the top of the tree, at this point, he might have a new limb that, is also 6 or so feet too tall now. So if there is a very straight limb that you do not want to regrow, make sure you cut it closer to the branch that it connects to. Don't leave as much of a stub there. Here's a couple of examples from his second winter. In this tree up here, you can see he had made some heading cuts. And I think the takeaway from this is, one, you're going to get a lot of regrowth. And so this is one of those situations where in that first summer, he might have been able to go through and remove some of these as they were still green and take some of the vigor out of the top of the tree and get more sunlight a little bit lower. The other example that I would say is, if there were weak side limbs, and maybe there weren't, but if there were, that weak side limb might have been able to take some of the energy, and maybe we would have gotten a little bit less of this really, really vertical regrowth. But because there were so many cuts being made, I think that you'd expect a decent amount of that drastic regrowth. So again, keep in mind that 1/3 rule. Don't take out so much the first year. You can hopefully minimize some of that regrowth that you get. And I think another thing to point out is, in this case, you can kind of see the tree shape he's going for. This is going to be sort of that multiple leader kind of shape. And so hopefully over time, these will bend down a little bit with the weight of the fruit. So he, certainly had that in mind. And I think that was a really good approach for what he was trying to do here. In this case, you can kind of see maybe this tree is going to be a little bit more of that central leader. We kind of have this main trunk, and maybe this can be the new main trunk and have these kind of side limbs going out from around it. So again, here's just a couple more pictures of some of the regrowth he had. Still a lot at the top that we're going to need to continue taking out. On this tree, this one's regrowth, it looks like you can see he actually did have some nice horizontal limbs that he could cut back to. And in this case, he didn't get quite as much upright growth. It looks like this tree also just had a bit more spurs. You can see these sort of short, stubby shoots. So that also took some of the energy out of the tree. So it can be a bit variable. And again, here's another tree that he had trained down. I think this was probably after his second season of cuts. And so in this case, we kind of have, again, more or less this main leader here. This is more or less a scaffold that's coming off of it. I imagine at some point, he can decide if he wants this to sort of be more of a multi-leader or if he wants to bring this back and treat this as a smaller scaffold. So again, I think this really illustrates trees are gonna not fit the mold, but you kind of want to go into it and have a rough idea of what the shape of the tree should ultimately be for you, and then you can kind of plan your pruning around that. So here's the last couple pictures he had. In this case, he had brought the tree height down quite a bit. Making some pretty big cuts here. He's still got some side limbs here, but the tree is still growing. He did this over a couple seasons, but what used to be a really tall tree is now a much more workable height for him. This is early, it's at bloom, so he's going to get vegetative growth back off of this. Some of these stubs, I'm sure, are going to have some dormant buds that are going to break, and he's going to get a bit more growth off of that. But he's got sort of that more or less multi-leader kind of going. And he's got, there's now the fruit buds lower in this tree. Obviously the tree's blooming. So, for his orchard, he kind of saw this as a success. And I think it's certainly a good way to go about doing it. And then the picture on the right here, this is one of his later prunings. I think this was in the 3rd year. So the main takeaway there is that you can see he's still taking out big limbs because he's still bringing down the height, but At this point, there's less, and he's starting to get into some of the finer wood. But again, still primarily those big cuts until he gets them back to the right height. And then he can get into more of that more precise maintenance style of pruning that we talked about. So a couple of final points, particularly whether you're renovating the tree for the first year or if you're doing some maintenance pruning, take out all the dead wood first. The dead wood does not impact that balance of the tree, so you can take that out whenever. It's not going to hurt the tree if you take out all the dead wood. It just doesn't have an impact on the tree anymore. My other big takeaway is, again, we want to lower the height back slowly. We really want to avoid as much of that really vigorous regrowth that we can. And so again, doing it incrementally is going to be our best way to do that. Again, we can take out about a third of the living wood every season before we really start to hurt the tree. So don't be afraid to take things out. But when you are taking things out, again, kind of go through the list, take out things that are dead. If there's a damaged limb, focus on taking that out. And anything that's very clearly diseased, those are really the first cuts that we want to make, regardless of if it's our first year or as we're doing maintenance. And then again, kind of broken record here, really focus on making your thinning cuts. That's really going to open up the tree the best. And it's also going to make sure you get less of that really crazy regrowth. And if you are not thinning it back, you want to keep some of it, just be sure you're heading back to some of those weaker growing limbs, because that'll kind of give you the best of both worlds. You'll still get part of that limb still there, but the regrowth that you get will be limited because you have that weaker limb to take some of the energy from it. And again, use those heading cuts carefully, but you can use those to your advantage if you need to develop new scaffold limbs. And my final main takeaway, again, kind of relating back to that taking out a third of the wood. On these big trees, like I was showing in some of those earlier slides, they have those really extensive root systems. So don't be too shy when it comes to pruning these old trees. The caveat is, again, think about a third, but if you cut out a big limb, chances are it's going to grow back, and it's going to grow back with a vengeance. So don't be afraid to get in and prune the tree. I think for a lot of these trees, just getting in and doing some pruning, and particularly if you remember those thinning cut rules, you're going to do so much more good than you could possibly, potentially screw up the tree. So just, get out there and give it a try. So if you guys want more information, a lot of the material I use and those diagrams of the multiple year working the tree down, that came from an Oregon State University fact sheet, Pruning to Restore an Old Neglected Apple Tree. Obviously, there's a lot of information out online. If I'm looking for info, looking at different extension fact sheets that are out there are certainly my go-to, and I definitely recommend looking for them as well. If you want to ask me any more questions, please feel free. My email, mrb254@cornell.edu. If you're interested in other events or other information, we have other fact sheets and link to the rest of the Cornell fruit resources. So please check out our team website at the address listed here. And also be sure to visit your local extension office, whether you're a homeowner and there's a master gardener person in your office, or if you're starting a farm, we have ag educators. So, I think the county office is, an excellent resource. So please stop in there and, come on out to more of our workshops. We're always happy to have people coming out to these things. So with that, I'd like to thank you guys for joining me on a Thursday evening. And if there's any final questions, please feel free to chime in, and it can be about pruning, or if we want to talk about anything else, feel free. I'll be here. We finished a bit early, so I kind of wanted to build in some time for questions, so please feel free to stick around and some questions. And as I mentioned, I have been recording this, so we will get the link out. If you can just send me a reminder email, that way I'll be sure to be able to get it out to you. And I can also send out PDFs of the slides to anybody interested. So again, just shoot me an email and I'll be sure to get those to you. And otherwise, have a good night. But again, if there's any questions, I'll happily take them. Hi, Nora. I see you're asking about pruning cherry trees. So there are going to be a lot of the same principles, particularly getting more of that sunlight into the tree. And cherries can be trained to similar styles as apples. Sort of that central leader or that multi-leader is a very common training system. So I think a cherry, you would use a lot of the same principles. Jacob, for peaches, they're going to be a little bit trickier, I think. So with peaches, the way they grow fruit is a little bit different than apples. So with apples and cherries, they produce fruit on spurs, and those will be on short 2-year-old limbs. Whereas in peaches, they'll produce fruit on 1-year-old wood. So because they don't have spurs, we kind of need to retrain the tree a little bit differently. So with peaches, our goal there is to actually get more of that renewal wood because we need a constant flush of new wood so that we always have 1-year-old wood on the tree. So it is a little bit more difficult. And if you're working with an old neglected peach, that could be a little bit trickier. That being said, there are peaches that are trained to a central leader. But it's just going to be, rather than getting those scaffold limbs, you'd still have some, but we want to make more heading cuts there to get more of that new flush going so we can get more peaches off of that. So there are some differences there. Sure. I'm sorry I can't explain that a little bit better. But generally, just if you're wondering, the most common training system for a peach is going to be what we call an open center. And so instead of having one main trunk, it's sort of like that multi-leader where the limbs aren't quite scaffolds and they're not quite leaders. They're a little bit in between. And from there, we would kind of have 1-year-old wood coming off of those scaffolds. So how late into March? You can pretty much do it into, certainly into early April. I think you'd still be okay. Once the trees start breaking dormancy, I would start laying off a little bit, but even through green tip, you should still be okay. We generally like to do it when it's dormant, but if they're an old tree and they're going to have a lot of vigorous growth, actually holding off a little bit could reduce some of the vigor. But if you do it in the next few weeks, if you do it before mid-April, I think you're still in pretty good shape. And I'll also mention that for apples and pears, we generally want to do dormant pruning. For stone fruits like peaches, we actually wait a little bit until the trees start to break dormancy because they're very susceptible to some fungal canker diseases. So we want the tree to be out of its dormancy so it can actively fight off that disease. And then cherries, we actually prune even later than that, around when they're blooming. So that's another good question. The question was, how do I go about treating the cuts to prevent disease or damage? So you'll see a couple times, we usually recommend that if you're going to make a big cut, you want to do it so that the cut isn't perpendicular to the upright, because the thought there is that if it's totally flat, the rain's going to hit it and you're more likely to get fungal diseases. So if we can make it on an angle, that would go a good way. That being said, there are a couple of different wax seals that you can purchase. You kind of take a paintbrush and apply it to the wound. And I know, talking to a couple of different researchers, that they've studied how much the tree responds to that, if it actually seals it up or not. And they found that it doesn't make all that much of a difference. Because sometimes what'll happen is if it's a little wet outside, when you put that seal on, it kind of locks that moisture in. So sometimes it could actually do a little bit, more damage than it does positive. But some people really still swear by it. I think it's one of those, there isn't really scientific evidence to it, but it kind of makes people feel better that they did something instead of nothing for it. And, you hear some anecdotal things. So some people still use it, but I don't think you really need to. But we also, and again, we try to not let the trees get to the point where we have to make really big limb cuts. But, if we have old abandoned trees, we can't really avoid them. So Jacob, that is, I'm sorry to hear that. There are a couple of things that you can potentially do. They're pretty difficult to do, but, and I think 2 years old, it would be pretty tough because they're so small. But on larger trees that have significant girdling from voles or what have you, there is some grafting that you can do. You would take some young limbs, and essentially you would graft from the bottom of where the damage was and then graft up to above the damage. And so what that actually does is it bridges that girdling, and I believe it's called a bridge graft because of that. And so you would take a couple of those budwoods and go all the way around the trunk to reconnect the vascular system. And then over time, that graft would heal itself over and kind of fill in that whole area. But you'd want to put in a couple of different grafts all the way around to kind of start that process. And if you have a grafting experience, you can do it, but it's pretty difficult to do because of the amount of cuts that you need to make. So, unfortunately, I think in that case, and since they are only 2 years old, I think your best bet is to probably replant them, unfortunately. And this time, making sure to keep the weeds down and putting a guard around the trunks. Sure thing. All right, any more questions, folks? Please keep them coming. All right, it looks like questions are slowing down, so I think we're going to go ahead and call it. But if you do have any more questions, please, again, feel free to send me an email or stop into your local office. And I wish you the best of luck pruning this year and in future years, or the next 5 years as you bring them back down to the height you want them at. And happy orcharding. Have a good one.